きいかがですか? Watanabe Dan desu. On today's episode of Backward Engineering Your Project, we're going to talk about something that seems to have been forgotten in Hollywood, and that is the importance of having the right budget for every one of your projects. Now, why would someone who's a creative be very, very concerned about budget? Because in all honesty, depending on what your project is about, the budget is going to determine whether or not it can get made. Now, I know for the past several years, this has not necessarily been the case. In fact, we have many, many projects that were way over budgeted for what they had the potential to make. And it was looked at as being Hollywood being artistic. No, what it really was Hollywood being profligate. The worst example of this is probably The Irishman. The Irishman cost $175 million for a typical Martin Scorsese movie. There's nothing wrong with Martin Scorsese movies. In fact, most Martin Scorsese movies are movies I really like, The Silence notwithstanding. But there was a problem with having an out of control budget for that. When you make a movie for $175 million in the theatrical realm, that movie needs to make close to $1 billion as its total. Now, Martin Scorsese, despite his high reputation as a great artist, has had very few out of the park box office hits. In fact, I might even go so far as to say that Goodfellas was his only one, maybe Casino, were his only ones that really, in the big leagues, hit it out of the park. Yes, Taxi Driver made a lot of money relative to its budget and was a hit in that way. But in terms of having massive mainstream appeal, I think those are really the only two. Now, people will look at me and say, but what about Raging Bull? Raging Bull lost money. There was a reason why Ordinary People won Best Picture that year. Not that it was a better movie, but that Raging Bull was a financial disaster. It didn't even make its original budget back on its initial release. So when they spent $175 million for a Martin Scorsese movie, there was no chance it would ever make $1 billion back as a theatrical. And when Netflix tried a test of it as a theatrical, it clearly didn't work, which is why they insisted that they were going to keep their original plan to be a keystone for what they were trying to do as a streaming company and to bring more talented artists to the fore. Now, it's very nice to bring talented artists to the fore, but let's get real about the amount of money. $175 million really represents adding about 250,000 new subscribers just for that project alone and having them stay with Netflix for the duration of 5 years. And that's just for one project. So how many of these can be done? As long as Netflix was on an eternal growth spurt and China was still someone who, still a market that looked like it was going to be willing to buy almost anything, this made some sense, I guess, if you're doing PowerPoint presentations and know nothing about what happened with previous instances of out of control spending based on the idea that you had a buyer who was willing to buy anything. Yeah, I guess you could see where in boardroom speak and with ignorance leading the charge and bringing up the truth, resulting in you being told you have a bad attitude. Yeah, okay, I can understand that. But the bottom line is that had Irishman been made for the kind of money that other studios were willing to spend for it, which is, maybe topping off at around 50 million, it probably would have been able to be a success. But with the amount of money that was spent, it was not able to be released theatrically properly. And it was quixotic to think that a company like Netflix could go on making things that were enormous loss leaders without having something that foundationally was a hit and would bring in a bazillion viewers. As we have seen, because of Netflix's propensity to drop everything at once, it's very easy for people to churn the service. It's very easy for anyone to churn any service if every episode is dropped at one time. That is why so many people have stopped doing that. Flash forward to today, where we're looking at an entertainment industry that is facing the reckoning of losing both China as the major market and losing streaming as being a guaranteed moneymaker. I lived through this before when home video in the foreign market, led by Japan at this point, completely disappeared in the early 90s. And so I know what this looks like, and this looks like that. And what this means is there needs to be a pivot into another area where profit can be reintroduced. Now, what does profit mean? It means that you are making something that will ultimately make money. This does not mean that you are going to go out there and just make the most obnoxious, lowbrow BS, although there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it is audience pleasing and you end up having incredible sales out of it. One of my friends from college has done almost 90 movies for Lifetime, and he loves making these. He thinks they're a blast, and God bless, because they are in fact really entertaining. When you start watching one of these, it's very difficult to stop. In the same way watching old TV movies from the 1970s is addicting, because they have this kind of take no prisoner side, because you're not being paid enough money to deal with a lot of bureaucratic BS about the creativity of it, because it's so low budget. And that's the beauty of low budget. When you look at directors such as John Waters, they made their fortunes, they made their reputations on a combination of doing things cheaply. Even Martin Scorsese at the beginning of his career was very focused on doing things that had enormously efficient budgets. First movie that ruined that, of course, was New York, New York. And then certain of his follow-up movies, which are made for winning an Academy Award, had the same problem. But whenever he would stick to a reasonable budget in the field that he was good at, he tended to do okay and at least make a profit. And that meant he kept working. And that is the goal. Now, let's look at the different budget levels and talk about what their limitations are. Because as you'll see, your creative limitations actually decrease the bigger the budget you have. So let's start at the very bottom. Let's start at things that cost under $1 million. And I know that there's multiple divisions below that, but for the sake of argument, and so this doesn't become an hour-long video, let's start with something that's made for under $1 million. Now, the closer you get to $1 million, the more you really need to have some kind of a buyer in mind. But you're probably going to be in the world of genre, where as long as you have those pleasing scenes that make the fans happy, you'll be just fine. Now, this can be low budget action. This can be low budget murder mysteries. This can be especially horror movies. In fact, $1 million can be quite the mid to even the very bottom rank of a higher budget. I know that when you look at Blumhouse, they're still doing things in the $4 to $5 million range, sometimes higher than that. But by and large, they're very high end now, because they have proven that they absolutely can deliver huge audiences on minimal investment, to where even if they have a massive failure, it's okay, because they've had so many successes that have busted the bank. And if you look at how Universal has been approaching the world of feature films, they did not get into the spiraling budgets bonanza. And Blumhouse kind of led the way to prudence in terms of investment. The next budget, within this, there's also the art films. Now, an art film is very dangerous, because I know everyone says that there's festival films, and there have been tales of bidding wars that have happened over the latest art house hit that debuted in a festival and pleased everyone. What has happened when those movies have gone out into the real world? Most of the time they have failed. And most of the time they failed through a combination of having something that might be pleasing to those who like to eat rare cheeses on expensive crackers and sip champagne, but they do not outreach to anything beyond a very, very small group. Now, if you're going to do a theatrical on that, you can actually make that work. New Line learned this 30 years ago with Metropolitan, a movie they picked up for almost nothing, and it ended up making $11 million. And I'm talking about a movie that was budgeted at $50,000. So that's actually a beautiful return. And the way they did it with Metropolitan is they platformed it. They opened it up small in college towns in urban or urban areas, so that it didn't have to play big, but it was able to be carried on word of mouth, because you also had a much longer window for theatrical at that point. So you were allowed to let things play. And that's how that type of movie would find its audience, because it had a little bit of time and it had a lot of positive reinforcement in terms of audience acceptance. But by and large, most movies that are made for art houses, you've got to look at it as a demo reel. It's not something that's really going to make money on its own. So if you don't have the scratch to just throw it away to have a nice, impressive demo reel, don't do it. Stick with something commercial, build yourself up, and build up your power base. The next level is between $1 million and $5 million. This is where you're going to be delivering maybe still somewhat artistic content, but you'll have a major selling element to it. And that major selling element to it might be a B-level star. And the reason you will make something in that budget level is that part of your marketing scheme for it is that you are going to use this B-level star as your chief advertising thing. How? You're going to position them as being worthy of winning an Oscar for this role. Now, I know the Academy Awards has kind of blown it short term. I'm hoping they can come back. They might not be able to. You know, it's ironic. Right before their 100th anniversary, they're going to completely blow it and become irrelevant. But in the past, and this was when I was in the home video market, when I first started my career, you were seeing this type of very clever marketing to a budget. You would make a movie for very little money and have a performance in it that you could nominate at least for an award, because it would have something that would catch the public fancy. Perhaps one of the great examples of that is Marilyn Matlin when she did Children of a Lesser God. Can we talk about a movie that seems to have absolutely no box office potential, but because she was one of the first deaf performers, they were able to leverage that up and use that as part of the free publicity, because she had a good story that got people to go and see it, and that in turn won her that award. You also had Geraldine Page, always a favorite, but never someone who was box office, be in a very low budget movie called A Trip to Bountiful, which was made specifically for her to finally get her Best Actress Oscar, which she did. And so that movie made almost 20 times its initial negative cost. So there we have the budget determining it. If that movie had been made for $50 million, it could never have made that back. A third one was Kiss of the Spider Woman. Now, we look at Kiss of the Spider Woman today and say, wow, this is really self-oppressive towards Latinos and gay people. But in 1985, it was quite revolutionary. And again, low budget, high art, pushing the two actors in it for Academy Awards. William Hurt wins, and the movie ends up making an enormous profit. This is why budgeting is important. And this is why when you have creatives who are in charge of the studios rather than business people or rather than mergers and acquisitions people, you can actually make great films. The next budget level is when we start getting into some of the danger zones. And this is the zone that's between $5 million, and I would say this is going to be a wide range, and 50 million. Back when I started in the industry, there was a lawyer by the name of Peter Deacon who said there is no business in the middle. And he said you had to make a movie for under 2 million or over 20. I'm going to suggest that even though that seemed polemic and even though it seemed overly intellectual, he was absolutely right. That when you made a movie below 2, you didn't need a theatrical. When you made it over 20, you needed a theatrical and you could put all the bling in it. But anything in the middle there was kind of half there. And so unless it was a masterpiece, it would probably fail. I'm going to now say that that number is 5 million and 50 million. And inflation does wonderful things. Between that range, you are going to have your B level and maybe an A level performer willing to do something for their art. And so they'll do it for less money. But you really don't have perhaps enough funds to fully support that star. Or worse, you are spending more than you should based on the concept of what you're doing. So you can make a movie that's very, very good for $12 million. But if it becomes a Netflix original as its highest and best, which means there ain't no tail to this. You've got your Netflix sale and that is it. You don't have an ancillary attached to that most of the time. So you better hope that international sale, that one-stop shop, gives you a profit. If it doesn't, you're done, because there isn't really the kind of money that used to be made in a home video release, and it's not as if they're not going to grab that as well. So you're kind of losing it at that. The challenge with this budget range is that a lot of times masterpieces are not made, and when a masterpiece is not made within that budget range, what ends up happening is people do not definitely recommend it or say it's excellent, which means it doesn't have word of mouth, which means it can't have a very, very long tail in terms of building an audience. And so this is the budget range where you absolutely have to be a masterpiece maker. You have to be someone who controls your cost as much as humanly possible, but at the same time are going to make something that really pleases an audience. And this is the danger that we're seeing right now for a lot of projects in the business, where you've seen kind of, maybe not at the level of The Irishman, but irresponsible amounts of money spent on a project that has no audience. A chief example of that is the most recent movie, Mank, which cost multiple millions of dollars. It's very artistic. It was in black and white. They did the right thing by trying to push it into a Best Actor category, but the subject was so limited and the movie didn't really hit that excellent apotheosis of performer part and cinematography and all the rest, to where it rose up on a wave of positive notice. Think of that movie as opposed to something like, let's say, Ed Wood, which did a lot of the same tricks, had a very low budget, but had an ability to connect with an audience because it was about a loser who kept trying. And in his own way, he won one of the great rewards in life, which is that he's remembered how many decades after his death. The problem with Mank is that unless you're a film student and you're obsessed with Citizen Kane, which I'm going to say a lot of film students secretly aren't. I know that I'm going to have a lightning bolt hit me right now, but I'm going to say that there's a lot of people who will say Citizen Kane is a masterpiece, but they don't like it. And that was a challenge with Mank, is that you're making a movie that's for film students, and yet you're spending way too much money for it because it's in that gap zone. If it had been made for that lower budget, I bet you it could have worked better, because then you wouldn't have had to play the game of trying to make it mainstream immediately. Then we have the budget level that goes above 50 million. This is where Hollywood has lost its mojo. The budget level above 50 million was something where, yes, it would have to be an A picture, but within the concept of it being an A picture, there was this understanding that you would have a lot of innovation technologically and technically. So in other words, your production design would be perfect. You would surround your star with adequate support. It wouldn't just be someone who's paid 40 million for the picture and everyone else is a scale plus tenor. You would have a great ensemble put together. And you would also have sufficient cushion to where you could do a lot of testing as the movie goes through its final cuts. And you would have an opportunity, if necessary, and without being ridiculous about it, to do reshoots. Now, at some point, I'm going to do another video about when do you do reshoots as opposed to when do you cut your losses. But let's cut to the brief chase here, and that is you don't do reshoots if the movie has a flaw in it that cannot be addressed. Let's say everyone says they hate the ending, and you decide, okay, we've got to change the ending because everyone else loves the rest of the movie and they hate the ending. In other words, you're making Fatal Attraction. And so you change the ending. And if a cocktail ending, it kind of undermines everything else in the movie. Doesn't matter. The movie's still a massive, massive, massive hit because the ending is something that audiences at that moment wanted. This was in the era of a lot of the teen horror movies. So having this kind of Freddy Krueger-esque ending was acceptable. It's not now, but that's why we have the original ending. That's now considered the standard ending of it. And yeah, we can laugh at the original horror movie ending, but it doesn't matter. But let's say you have something where you have your lead performer undermined by your supports. And your supports are doing much better than the lead. Now you've got an issue that's very difficult to fix. And this is what happened with West Side Story, is that you have all of these supporting players absolutely dominating your leads to the point where it's difficult to remember it's even a romance because you're remembering the small players, but they're not the reason people go to the movie. So therefore, there's no reason for someone to see the film. Yes, everyone talks about, oh, how wonderful the production is. No. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how innovative you are. If an audience is not connected to you emotionally, you're dead. So this is why you got to be very careful when you get to that upper level, because you have to keep a consciousness on who the audience is. Now, when you get above $100 million, doesn't matter whether it's 100 million or 250 million, you must appeal to the mainstream. Must. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about this. You cannot be niche marketed. You cannot be for a small segment of the population. So what has happened with a lot of these spirally budget movies is that you have a movie that is displeasing to the mainstream, and therefore it underperforms. Look at the recent film, 335. What went wrong with that movie? Now, a lot of people will immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, it's because it had women in roles that normally featured men, and that it's just a bunch of sexists in the industry. Can we say that there were caper movies that were made in the past, which had very strong female leads? Topkapi, Gambit, How to Steal a Million. This was not a problem for them. What was wrong with this movie? What was wrong with this movie is it did not have a connection to the emotional core of the audience. This was yet another film that was made deliberately as an attack on males. It was like, women can do it all, that we don't need males to be a major part of this picture. Well, when you're doing a caper type movie, one of the things, okay, this is old school, but one of the things is that there's a romantic edge to it. And when there's that romantic edge to it about the person who's maybe a little bit hesitant about getting involved, and they're romantically involved with the person who is the mastermind. And because of that, there's a tension, and that tension leads to the romantic sparks flying at an inopportune moment. That is an audience involvement on the emotional level in a huge way. That was not done with this film. So therefore, it bombed. Let's also talk about why The Eternals bombed. A problem with the Eternals is that it's almost like the pilot of a new TV show where you're having to introduce too many characters. And unfortunately, rather than making the characters interesting because of who they are personally and focusing on their personable foibles, focusing on their value systems and how they're in conflict with one another. Think of an average sitcom. The Eternals should have been structured like an episode of Friends or Modern Family or The Mary Tyler Moore Show, but it wasn't. So what you have is you have a laundry list of people who have attributes, and these are attributes that they have no control over, nor do these attributes necessarily determine the way they intersect with the world. And because of that, the characters come across as being dull. They don't come across as being people we want to spend time with. They come across as polemics. And so the movie feels like a lecture. And because of that, it doesn't give the genre satisfaction. I definitely preferred Shang-Chi, because even though Shang-Chi as an Asian was very cringy, it had the benefit of not taking itself seriously and of positioning the central character as if he was Mary Richards surrounded by Rhoda and Phyllis and Mr. Grant and Murray and Ted, because everyone in it was an out of control eccentric. And you had this guy in the center of it who was rather an everyman. Even if he was ethnically a little bit different, he still was very American in his worldview and in the way he presented himself. So it's very easy to identify him as the normie, and then everyone else became amusing. So despite the fact it didn't really work as well as I think it would have if it was released now, it still made more than clearly Disney felt, because Disney kind of dumped it out there theatrically, thinking it was going to fail. And then it surprised them that, yeah, it didn't make a good profit overall. But considering when it came out in terms of people going back to theaters, it was indeed a pleasant surprise. And then we can look at something like the new Spider-Man movie, which again cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but it delivered in a big emotional way to the audiences. So that's why it took 5 weeks for the remake of Scream to knock it out. Now, unfortunately, when you're looking at Scream, you're having people say that was only a success because it was an already pre-sold title. I'm going to disagree, because it's been a while since there was the last Scream movie. And okay, yeah, horror fans are going to go because horror fans like good murders, and that's the key. You have a good murder in it, doesn't matter how shop worn it is, you're going to go and you're going to have a good time. But I know it delivered, because the people I know who've seen it, I haven't seen it yet, have all said, yeah, you know what, it's really good. I'll go see it again. And that's the key. But again, on this big budget level, you must please the majority of your audience. And so if you're going to make films that antagonize a part of that audience, and you think that that's wonderful, that you're just showing them, you just showed yourself the door with the new metrics in the industry that they have to adopt because of the rolling off of the growth of all streaming services and the loss of China, and the fact that many American movies, because of their obsession with delving into America-only politics, you're now seeing the European market getting much softer than it should be. So we'll see what the reckoning is. We'll see what Bob Chapek, the CEO of Disney, is going to do. Now, Bob Chapek has already raised a lot of hackles by his memo, which is really pretty basic. It is subtextually saying, I'm about to fire the lot of you. But within that, saying that we must focus on the audience is not a negative. When you're spending that kind of money, it is irresponsible and decadent to feel that your artistic vision can say F you to the audience as a whole, and it is okay if something bombs because you are some kind of a warrior for truth. No, you're not. You're in this business to make money. And if you weren't, you could always give it to charity, and no one does that. So it's time to look at the budget, seriously think about how big your audience is, seriously consider how you can best maximize the number of people who will like it to where you are positive and in the black once the picture is done with everything. And yes, this also applies to series. You're spending 15 million an episode, which I hear that some of these shows are doing. They don't have a lot of episodes. You're never going to make that money back. So that's going to be forced to change as well. It's an interesting time in the entertainment business. I think there's a responsibility that's coming back. There's going to need to be outreach to the gap audiences that have been ignored. And this is very good for people who are looking to enter. Remember, the entertainment industry was torn out of the California desert from nothing. And it became a massive cultural force. This was not done by people looking to do art. This was done by people who cared about their audience. And that is the ultimate lesson of show business. High society. I got